Hello, I'm Annika Fajardo. I'm one of the librarians here at St. Kate's, and very excited to see so many people here today. Jonathan Odell grew up in Mississippi. He's worked in business and he's been a civil rights activist in a variety of settings. His writing and activism are strongly influenced by the South, where he grew up and where his books are set. His first novel, A View from Delphi, there's a few copies here tonight, was published in 2004. Kirkus Reviews called it a fast-paced but thoughtful story of friendship across the racial divide in 1950s Mississippi. In 2005, A View from Delphi was featured on Talking Volumes, the joint book club of Minnesota Public Radio, the Star Tribune, and the Loft Literary Center. The Healing, John's second book, also takes place in Mississippi, but on a pre-Civil War plantation. The novel has been compared to Catherine Stockett's The Help and Toni Morrison's Beloved. The Healing has been praised for its vibrant characters, its well-researched history, and its lyricism. The New York Post called it required reading, which it is literally here at St. Kate's for Marcia Bird's nursing class, which is part of the reason we have so many people here today. So when John sent me the advanced reading copy of The Healing, I couldn't put it down. I just devoured the whole thing. And then I had to keep checking the front cover to remind myself that this narrative is not written by an adolescent slave girl. It is actually written by an adult white male living in modern-day Minnesota. And if you haven't read The Healing yet, it will blow you away. And if you haven't bought it yet, there are some copies for sale here tonight from the bookstore. And John will be signing books at the outside of the ballroom after the program. John is a fabulous writer, and I think you'll find he's a fabulous reader and speaker. Help me in welcoming Jonathan Odell.
Good evening. Thank you for braving the winter again to be here. How many people have read The Healing? Let's see. And how many people have bought it but haven't read it yet? And how many people haven't bought it yet? Okay, you're my target audience tonight, so it's really great to be here. My history with St. Kate's goes back a few years. Where's Marcia Bird, Dr. Bird? Would you stand up just for a sec? There you go. Just Marcia had read The View from Delphi several years ago and thought it would make a good read for St. Kate's as they were dealing with multicultural issues, talking across race. And we did a diversity day. And what the nurses, the staff asked me are, what are you writing next? And I said, well, I don't know, it's a book about midwives. They said, that's the one we want to read. So, and off and on, Marcia allowed me to take my manuscript to St. Kate's, and we had a group of professional nurses to read the book and give me feedback on those scenes of birthing to make sure I had it technically correct. As a gay man, that's not where I thought I wanted to go, was into the birthing room. That's not what I said I wanted to do when I decided to write this book, but it led me there, and thank goodness there were people like Marcia and the professors who helped me gently as a white male understand at a deeper level what this is all about, and I never really understood. What I'm going to do tonight is just tell you a little bit about how I came to write the book, and then I have a couple of excerpts I'd like to read to you. Then I'd like to just open it up for questions. So as I talk, just be thinking about what you'd like to know from me. And all the questions are open, whether it's about the book or whether it's about writing in general or getting published or agents. If you want to know that, that's fine. If it's about my personal life, that's fine too. There's something about an author's personal life is their book, so it's hard to pull that apart. So if there are things you're curious about my growing up or my being educated or my experiences, I love those questions because it makes me think also at a deeper level and gives me material, of course, for the next book. I was born in a place called Laurel, Mississippi. Laurel, Mississippi is in southeastern Mississippi. It's about 20,000 people, half black, half white, which is like most towns in Mississippi. Most towns are very small towns, and most of them have high percentage of African Americans. The day that I was born was May the 9th, 1951. Now, as my mother was giving birth to me at Masonite Hospital, R.H. Mason was one of our town fathers. He invented Masonite, so Laurel was kind of an industrial town in the South. As she was giving birth to me, about 4 blocks away from the hospital, at the courthouse, there was a black man who was being legally lynched, and his name was Willie McGee. And you probably don't recognize that name today. But in 1951, Willie McGee was accused of raping a white woman in Laurel. His trial had gone all the way to the Supreme Court. There were riots in Paris, France. He was on the picture, he was on the cover of Time magazine, on Look magazine, on Life magazine. Jean-Paul Sartre got involved, Einstein got involved, and Bella Abzug, does that name familiar to you? This was her first case. She came down from New York to Mississippi to try this case. And I did not know about this until I was 45 years old. You know, if you go 4 blocks on the other side of town, what we call the kind of the good side of town, the rich side of town, you pass by a mansion. It's occupied by, about 1951, was occupied by Mrs. Chisholm. Mrs. Chisholm was the wife of the president and owner of the bank there in Laurel. And she was an ancestor of the founding fathers of Laurel, Mississippi. And about this time, if you walked into her living room, you might see a little girl, about a 15, 14, 13-year-old girl playing the grand piano, a black girl who happened to be the niece of the woman who took care of the house, of the housemaid. And she was supposed to be helping her aunt that day clean up, but instead she sat down at the baby grand and started playing the piano and singing. Miss Chisholm walked in and was so stunned by what she heard, she made sure that this girl got into Wilberforce College and then later into Juilliard. Her name was Leontine Price. And if you don't know that name, you just need to go look up that name. She's an American treasure. So that was going on the day that I was born. Then if you go to the south side of town, what we call the bad side of town, you'll see a man named Sam Bowers. And Sam Bowers is a town father. He's a Sunday school teacher. People look up to him because he's a self-made businessman. He's probably closing up his shop about this time, about 5 o'clock when I was being born. And his shop is called Sambo's Amusement Company. And what he does, he rents out pinball machines and games for bars. He's only a few years away from being the imperial wizard of the KKK of Mississippi Burning fame. If you saw Mississippi Burning, the man who orchestrated all that was our Sunday school teacher, Sam Bowers. So this is home sweet home. That's what I was born into. And the crazy thing about it, being raised in a white bubble, I didn't know any of this stuff. None of it. And all this, even the stuff that hit on the national news, Martin Luther King came and marched through my town. I didn't know that until I was writing my first book and went back to the library. In fact, I went to the library that day to look up the Laurel Leader Call. And you know how you get bored and you say, okay, I wonder what was going on the day that I was born. So I go to the paper and I look on May the 9th, 1951, and there is a full-page picture of the courthouse. There are 1,000 white men and women on the courthouse lawn cheering at midnight as the electric chair went off and killed Willie McGee. And on that lawn were my Sunday school teachers and the parents of my friends. And I'm going, I'm 45 years old and I don't know about this. So I went to my parents and I said, how come you never told me about Willie McGee? And they said, who? I never heard of that. Nobody knew. Then I looked on the May 10th edition of the paper, and there was a letter from the mayor, Carol Garton at that time, saying, let's just put this recent unpleasantness behind us and never talk about it again, because we need to make Laurel a place we can be proud of. So it was just swept under the rug. Now, when I got to be an adult, and I became shocked about these things that I didn't know, and I start talking to other white Southerners who grew up in this crucible of civil rights, and they're just as ignorant as I was. It was like, how did we get to be so blind? Now, as Northerners think they understand the South, they say, well, it's because of segregation, because they separate you down there. Well, think about it. If a town is 20,000 people and half are black and half are white, they can't keep you separated. Yeah, the schools are legally segregated, and the churches, and go to the movies, and the blacks set up what they call the crow's nest upstairs, and we sat down on the downstairs. But we were intricately involved in each other's lives. We shopped together in the same stores. We walked on the same sidewalks. Black women were in white homes raising the children. We ate each other's food. We were intimately involved. And what I wanted to know, if we're that so involved, how did I get so blind about it? And that's when I remembered a story. It was when I was about 7 years old, and I was sitting out in the backyard. It was a summer day in the backyard, and I looked over at Miss Callahan's yard. Miss Callahan was an older white woman, and every older white woman in the South has carte blanche to pick up any young Southern boy and slap him if he's not acting like a gentleman. And their job in the community is to make sure you produce young, Southern, fine gentlemen. And I love Miss Callahan. She was the one who told me to keep my elbows off the table and not talk with my mouth full. And she paid attention to me and saw something in me, so I really loved her dearly. She was a Christian woman. And this day in her backyard, there was a black man. He was probably 60 or 70 years old. He looked ancient. At that age, he's probably my age now, but he was raking, and he was wearing a flannel shirt, and it must have been 100 degrees. So I was curious. I probably wasn't wearing a shirt or wearing something really short sleeves. So I went over and said, "How come you wearing that heavy, hot shirt?" And he says, "Well, honey," that's what I love about the South, is everybody calls you honey, whether you're men or women. Just, "Well, honey," he said, "when it sweats, when it gets really hot and you're wearing a shirt like this, you sweat. And then when the wind blows, it's like air conditioning, so it cools you off." And I thought, well, this is the wisdom of the ages. And I really liked this guy, mainly because he talked to me as a child, not at me or above me. He just got on my level and talked with me. So I was making my new friend. And there's something in the South called, it's a nomenclature. I think it exists still. But as you're growing up, you learn the titles of respect for people. People who were like your parents' age, you called Mr. Johnson or Mrs. Smith, their last names. As people got older, maybe your grandparents' age, you switched. You called them Mr. Joe. Use their first name with the Mr. to show respect. And the older woman, you never call Mrs. You called Miss Willie or Miss Lucille. And Miss Callahan came down, Miss Helen came down, and she said, "What are y'all doing? What are y'all talking about?" Just as sweet. And I love that. I can still smell the way she smelled. She had this, the powder that older women wore in those days, and it just smells like a rose garden and lilacs. And she says, "What are y'all doing?" very sweetly. And I wanted to mind my manners. So I said, "I'm talking to Mr. Joe," wanting to make sure she knew I was civilized. And she says, "Oh, no, Johnny, Joe's not a mister. Joe's a," and then she used the N-word. Now, in that moment, I knew something important was happening, even as a 6 or 7-year-old kid. So I looked at Miss Helen, and she was the same sweet Christian lady she always was. And she was smiling at Joe. In fact, the next thing she did was she looked over and said, "Joe, would you like some lemonade? I'd be glad to go get you some." She actually cared for Joe. In her way, she loved Joe. And I looked at Joe to see if it was okay with him, and he was nodding and smiling. He said, "That'd be nice, Miss Helen. I'd like some lemonade." And so as a white boy, the message was, oh, Joe and I are different, and it is about color, and my color is more important than his. And his story is not important, and only my story is. So from then on out, I've learned that in the South, even though we don't have physical segregation, we had psychological segregation. We were trained early on not to see black folks, only as maids or as gardeners or as background. We never saw them as people. And even in the South when I was growing up, it was against the rules. These rules, nobody ever taught you. They didn't sit down and teach them to you, but you knew when you were breaking them, and you learned easily. One was that black folks never looked white folks in the eye, because that was a challenge to authority. And I used to think, oh, that's just this perverted way of Jim Crow power. And then when I thought about it, I thought, no, I know what that's about. Because if you look at somebody in the eye, they're no longer a maid. They're no longer one of those people. They're a father, or they're an uncle, or they're an aunt. And this whole perversion of Jim Crow falls apart because it's based on the other being less than you are and being different. So we were psychologically taught not to see the things around us. And I'd moved to Minnesota when I was 30, and I'd have been here about 6 years. And I was sobering up. Thank God he got me here. I didn't know this was a place of 20,000 treatment programs. But I was growing up gay in Mississippi and drinking a lot. And in fact, if I recommend it, if you're gay in Mississippi, I recommend just getting drunk a lot. Because that was the only thing that saved me. And I got to Minnesota, and I realized, oh, this isn't normal behavior. Not everybody does the things I do, like drink to oblivion. So I decided I would go into treatment. And after about 6 years in treatment, if you've ever been into a 12-step program, you think it's about drinking, or it's about sex addiction. No, it's all about healing the internal brokenness. You have to admit that you're broken. You have no control over that brokenness, and you do things that can best heal you. And one of the ways that I was broken was my whole identity. I realized I was getting this feeling that the story that I was told about myself, this white history, this Confederate history, this American history that I was taught as a reflection of who I was based on a pack of lies. And in other words, my whole self-identity as a white man in this society, cracks started coming up in the foundations. And if it's not true, then all my goals that I've set for myself are not worthwhile goals. Climbing to the top of the heap, being number one man in the organization, accumulating a lot of money, living in a really safe part of town with a big house, all those things that just kind of flow out without thinking. Well, it was 1988, and I remember I was sitting in my living room, and it was the 20th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. And every 10 or 20 years, anniversary of either his I Have a Dream speech or his assassination, there's always this to-do about what's the state of the dream? Is the dream dead? How are we doing now? And so they were showing these old film clips, and they were from my hometown. And I saw Dr. King and Dr. Abernathy, and I just kind of went to sleep because I saw those on Walter Cronkite growing up on a Huntley Brinker. It was just history, not my history. It was just history. But for the first time, I looked over to the people on the side of the road. And these were the white people throwing the rocks and waving the Confederate flags and yelling out the epithets. And then it hit me. I said, oh, my God, those are my people. Those are my people. I am part of this. And then it hit me, this is not black history. This is my history. This made me who I am. And those people marching down the street made me who I am. And I don't know a damn thing about them. And you have those transformational moments in your life once or twice if you're lucky. Oh, this is one of those transformational moments where I just broke down and I started crying. It was crying for loss. It was crying for not knowing who I was, the artificiality of my family, of my community, of things that I used to hold as sacred. My entire religion was built on white supremacy. It was all nothing, and I didn't know what to do. And luckily, the next day in the Star Tribune, there was a writer who did a story called "Is the Dream Dead?" And she called up random people from across the country and interviewed them, black and white, and there was one that caught my eye, and it was Mayor Fannie Smith of a little town in Mississippi called Falcon, Mississippi. And I looked up Falcon, it was only like 300 people, very small town, but the mayor was African American. And also she was exactly my age. So I said, I believe in signs from God. I said, this must be a sign from God. I'm going to do it. So I called her up. I found out her number and gave her a call and said, Miss Smith, you don't know me, but we were born at the same time, lived in the same state, grew up in two different worlds. And I don't know a thing about your world. And I've got a feeling that your world helped to create mine. And if I came down there, I said, do you have stories you could tell me about your world? She says, honey, do I have some stories I can tell you? So I took her up on it. I took a leave from work. I knew it was important. I flew into Memphis. I rented a car. I drove into the Mississippi Delta. She owned the pick-a-pack convenience store. She was sitting there on the crate of her apple crate behind the counter, and introduced myself. She took me to the back room, and she told me these stories about her people. And for the first time, I didn't try to fix her. I didn't try to apologize. I told her she was exaggerating. Good things have changed, you know. I just listened to her stories and let them affect me, and it blew me away. If those who have read The View from Delphi, several of you remember the character Levi. He was the preacher, the black preacher in the story. Well, she told me about her granddaddy, who was what she called an in-between man. He was really respected in the community, and the blacks would send him on errands or messages to talk to the white people to get favors, because the court system didn't work for blacks and the economy didn't work for blacks in the stores. So you had to have what they called in the South, blacks had to have them an angel, a white angel. And the white angel would look out after you, would would talk to the judge for you, get you out of jail, et cetera. So he was kind of a black angel. He would go to these white people. He was really respected. He wore a suit, never drove a day in his life, and just walked the roads. And one day, he didn't come home, and they couldn't find him. And they had to wait till morning, and they found him the next morning in the ditch, dead. Somebody had hit him in a car and killed him. So Fanny said she went to the sheriff, who knew her grandfather really well, did business with him, respected him, and said, somebody's a hit and run. Somebody killed my grandfather. And he said, oh, Fanny, he said, you know, Mr. Bill, he lived him a long, good life. Let's just don't go stirring up no trouble, okay? And she told me about that, and it was like, how come that wasn't in my history book? How come I didn't learn about this? Because this is about what made me feel so superior. These stories were kept away from me. My shame that I should have been living with I was kept safe from. Then she took me across the street, and she introduced me to a man. He had to be in his 80s or 90s, and he lived in this old shack. And she said, I want you to meet him because Mr. Lester, he marched with Dr. King when he came through here. And I was looking in the shack and Dr. King, and I said, well, it doesn't look like things have changed much. He says, honey, he said, let me tell you how things have changed. The day before Dr. King came through here, I was a boy. The day he left, I was a man. And when he said that, I was like, oh, and my arrogance, I thought the vision was about getting you money. It was a transformational movement that was happening. And in fact, I had to get over the fact that Falcon, Mississippi was a very, very broken town, very, very poor town. But I also found there were a lot of people there who had a lot of pride. There was a community that stuck together. I asked her how she got to be mayor of this town. And she said, honey, that wasn't hard. She said, Falcon has 300 people. 299 are black. There's one white person, and she lives on the other side of the tracks. So she says, so don't be fooled. Things ain't changed that much. And she took me to a woman I didn't know how to appreciate at that time, but she called her Mother Pearl. She said she's a midwife. Well, I didn't know anything about midwives, so I wasn't really interested at that time. So I went ahead and I wrote my book. And View from Delphi, and after it came out, this whole thing about the midwife kept kind of haunting me. It's like, because again, in my white history, I was taught that midwives were kind of a scourge. They were dangerous. They were superstitious, believed in silly superstitions like burying the placenta in the backyard, or we'd laugh about they put the knife under the bed to cut the pains of the patient. Isn't that funny? Ha, 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 kind of. And that they were dirty and that they were abortionists. And, you know, thank God the white medical practice came along and saved us from those midwives. And yet that didn't jive with my interviews. When I would interview black folks and they'd talk about midwives, they'd always call the midwife mother. They took pride in which midwife birthed them, like every midwife had all these kids, and they were part of a big family because they were birthed by Leontine Price's mother was a midwife. She birthed the mayor of Laurel, Mississippi, I found out. When I went to interview the black mayor of Laurel, Mississippi, asked him to tell me about himself, the thing that he was the proudest of is he was birthed by Miss Lucille. Everything else came second. It was that kind of pride. And when these women and men talked about their midwives, there were tears in their eyes. They were like saints in the community. And I got the feeling they were even more powerful than the black ministers. It's in some way. So I said, this is not making sense to me. How come I've learned this, and yet what I'm learning from the black community is totally different? So I decided to do some studying about the history of the midwife. And what I found was another one of those places where the black history has to be erased and pushed aside so the white history can be dominant. In the night after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, when whites started taking control of things again, white doctors did not want to touch black flesh. There was nothing in it for them. So within the community itself, the community would raise up these wise women. These women that knew the ways of women, that knew the ways of children. And they had traditions that were handed down from their people. And they were called midwives. They were powerful in the communities until the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. And then when public health money started to flow into programs in the South, then the doctors and the medical organizations wanted to take control again. But they had to get rid of the midwives because these midwives were powerful. They were the biggest barrier. And so there was a concerted effort between the medical establishment and the state legislatures to vilify the midwife. And you go back through old AMA journals in the 1940s and 50s, and there are some horrible articles written ridiculing the midwife, making fun of the granny doctor, talking about what abortions and how dirty they were, laughing about their superstitions. So that soon every state had licensure laws. And one of the laws that kicked out more midwives was they had to be literate. A lot of these women couldn't even read. I mean, they knew about birthing from in here. They didn't learn about it from up here, but they couldn't read, so they got moved aside. Then I found these studies that said in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, when the white doctors were taking over, the live birth rates were higher under these old granny women than they were these sophisticated doctors that took over. And you think of that maybe strange at first, but then think about it again. These midwives grew up in this community. Not only did they birth this baby, they probably birthed that baby's mama and her mama. So she knows about anything genetic going on in the family. The problem with birthing that they may have had generation-wise is the width of the hips. And also they understood poverty, which white doctors never understood, how people can live and thrive with the techniques of living in poverty. They would make sure the baby were clothed and they had food if they didn't have food. And of course, the white doctor, you had to go in on his time and go into his operating table and then present yourself in this horrible, demeaning way to the doctor so that he could see better. And they had the community wasn't used to that, and a lot of the mothers died as a result of that. So when I found that out, I went, oh my gosh, I need to write this story. Again, that's how a gay man decided he was going to go into a birthing room. It wasn't because I was interested in the process of birthing, but when I found that, it became such a metaphor for society, for community, how we birth each other, how we hold the threads of society together, the threads of family together. And I said, I've got to find I need a voice. So I had all these studies and some interviews, but I really needed a heroine. I have a friend. His name is Don Samuels. I don't know if you know him. He's councilman over in Northside. And I was telling him that I was going to write a book with black characters. He kind of rolled his eyes, and here's a white boy going to write more about this. That's what we need, another white guy writing about black characters. He said, just do one thing. Do one favor for me. I said, what? He says, do not write another To Kill a Mockingbird. And I went, why? I mean, every white liberal person loves To Kill a Mockingbird. That won a Pulitzer Prize. I mean, that's. He says, I do not want my children to have to read one more book about some poor, ignorant black man who needs saving by a white man. He said, that seems to be the only thing that a white person can write when he puts black people in there is how he's going to save him. Some good-hearted white man has to come along and do that. He said, if you're going to write a book, I'd rather your black characters, if they're criminals, that's fine. If they're derelicts, that's fine. Just give them some guts, let them stand on their own 2 feet, and make them a complex human being in their own world. And when he said that, it's like the lights went on. Every piece of literature that I loved, that made me cry in the end as a white person, was when the blacks showed how grateful they were to the white man for saving them. Do you remember To Kill a Mockingbird in that courtroom scene where Atticus is leaving, and then the black minister looks down at Atticus' children and said, "Stand up, your father's passing"? Every white person in the world cries at that scene. There's this payoff. Oh, see how wonderful we are to be able to save the black person. You see The Blind Side? I mean, the thing that tears you apart, and I'll still cry at the end, is when this man, who's actually an intelligent, together guy, is portrayed as this ugly doofus black man who needs saving by this white woman, and in the end he goes up and hugs her. And it's like, oh, there's not a dry tear in the house. What amazed me was black people weren't feeling the same thing when watching these things. I thought, oh, wow. So I said, okay, I really want to find a character this time, a black character who doesn't need anything from white people, whose life is not dictated by what a white person does. And I needed a strong character to do that. So I went down south in search of a midwife that was going to be my heroine. I'd read a couple of books. One is about Oni Lee Logan, Mother Wit. That was the woman I wanted to find. I wanted to find somebody like her. That's a book of a nonfiction about the life of a midwife. I forget, she's in Georgia or Alabama. But so I went to this white man, and I asked, I'm looking for a black midwife that would talk to me. And he says, you ought to talk to Ms. Willie. She used to live on our plantation. Now, she's old now and she's deaf, but she'd be a great person to talk to. He said, but you can't call her directly because she can't hear on the phone. When you pick it up, she'll pretend like she can hear, but she can't hear. So you need to call her daughter. And her daughter, then you tell the daughter what you want, and then she'll call her mom. So I called the daughter, and I said, now I heard that your mother was a midwife, and I'd love to talk to her about her day's midwife. You think she'd talk about that? She said, honey, she said, would she talk about it? You're not going to get her to shut up. Said, because I got the feeling that this woman wanted to talk about what was so precious to her. So I went over to her house, and I walked in the door. And Ms. Willie was 92 years old. She had this beautiful yellow dress on, just sun-bright yellow dress. And she had just done her hair, so you could tell this day was important to her for some reason. And I went up and shook her hand, and she clasped my hand. I mean, she gripped it, and she looked at me, and I've never felt more blessed by any preacher that I've ever come in contact. I just felt blessed. And it was like, you're my child. Just felt that. But it was in a way out of power. It wasn't out of weakness or softness. It was like, you're in my world and I take care of you, honey. It's that feeling. So we sat down and we talked for 2 hours. And it was an interesting conversation. I'd write the questions down so she could read them, and my handwriting didn't help a lot. So she'd say, you want to know, and then the daughter would read it, and then the daughter would say, Mama, he wants to know so-and-so. So she'd yell at her mother, and then I would yell at her, yeah, I want to know. And then she'd start yelling at me, oh, you want to know that? And so for 2 hours, we were just yelling and screaming at each other. And this woman had razor wit. I mean, she was sharp. And she had a devilish wit, as we call it. She could cut you to the core if she wanted to and smile at you at the same time. Like I asked her, I said, I'd like to write a scene where the mother fights the midwife. I want a scene where the mother has that moment where, oh my God, I don't want to go through this. I'm not going to live. So I said, did you ever have a mother fight you? She says, fight me? I had one bite me. And I said, one bit you? I said, what'd you do? She said, I slapped that woman in the name of Jesus. And she says, and that baby went whoop. Oh, he was laughing and laughing and laughing. She could be so irreverent, but in such a spiritual way. She had all that. And she was poor. She didn't have a hospital to rely on. She couldn't run out and get the doctor if she was in trouble. She had to make it up as she went. And I said, do you ever have any I wanted a scene in my book where the baby wasn't breathing and the midwife breathed her breath into it. I read that happening. I said, did that ever happen to you? She said, oh, Johnny. She said, and I said, what'd you do? Well, she said, there's a series of things that I did. She said, if they weren't breathing, yeah, I'd try to breathe my breath into them. And sometimes I wouldn't do it. And then what I'd do, I'd always have hot water going on the stove. You always do that. When you walk in, you get your hot water going. And she says, I get the steaming water in a bucket, and then I set a crate of an empty apple crate on top of the bucket. Then I put a pillow in there and then lay the baby on that. And so the steam rises up and warms the baby. Oh, that's kind of brilliant. And she says, and if I said, if that doesn't work, what do you do? Oh, she says, well, I got the stove warm, so I'll just scoot that baby in the oven. And because it's not broiling, it's just like on a little warm. Well, she was making do with incubators. It was brilliant. And I said, you save any baby? She says, I saved 5 children that way. And she said, and every one of those children is walking around today with my breath in them. And so she was introducing me just not to the techniques of birthing. She was introducing me to the values of a community, the spirit of a community. And before I left, I said, if you could sum up midwifing for me, I said, do you still think about it? Do you miss it? She says, oh, honey, she says, there's not a night that goes by that I don't dream that I'm still in the delivery room. And she says, I'm always delivering babies. She said, my hands never forget what to do. She said, it only tells me, I guess I quit before my time. And that's like heartbreaking. And she's telling me these stories because I think she's afraid her stories are going to be lost. There's nobody asking these questions anymore. If they are, they're laughing about it. So I say, can you sum up what being a midwife meant for you? And she said, thought for a minute. She looked out the window and she said, in this county alone, I caught 2,063 babies. And she said, every one of them calls me mother. But she says, you know, Johnny, every one of them is still my child. And when she said that, I knew what the heroine was. I knew what the essence, what midwifing was, what midwifing a community meant. So she became my heroine. When the book was finally accepted, I called her up. I want to say, Ms. Willie, we got published. And but she had died. She died in 2010 at 99 years old. So I was going, oh gosh, before anybody knew her story. But then I Googled her and found out the Mississippi State Legislature gave her a commemoration. 100% of the legislators voted a commemoration for her life spent midwifing babies. So she got recognized. This lady from Midnight, Mississippi. And when the book came out, someone came on my Facebook page and she said, I tried to find the family. I couldn't find the family. I wanted somebody. I just was so proud that we captured her, and I wanted to know how we did, and couldn't find anybody. The book had been out. Then I got an email saying, my name is Michelle Turner, and Mrs. Willie Turner was my grandmother, and we don't know anything about this book. I went, oh my gosh, I'm going to get sued. So I wrote her an email and I said, I tried to find the daughter that I taught with. I couldn't find anybody. And she said, and I said, but read over the materials. And on my website, I'm telling you this, on my website, that interview with Ms. Turner, Random House thought it was so important that they edited and cleaned up that interview. So you can listen to her voice. You can listen to Polly Shine's voice on my website, and you can see a picture of her. But I told her granddaughter, if there's anything that demeans her memory, please let me know, and I'll change it. And she wrote me back and said, oh, no. She says, you're making Granny live again. And said, she birthed me. And then I had a call from an uncle, and then I had a call from a couple of the children, and I've been invited to the family reunion in Belzoni, Mississippi, which is the catfish capital of Mississippi, by the way. So it's like brought us together. Other things, I knew the book would be a book club book, and most of the readers in America today are white women, and 98% are of people who buy fiction are white women in book groups. So I knew that was a great market. But my secret was that I wanted this to find another market. I wanted tonight to happen. I wanted to finally look out for a group of people and not just see a bunch of white people. I wanted the book to be able to also bring us together in race, and for it to be seen as respectful. And the greatest praise that I get is when I get a letter from a black woman who's a professor in Massachusetts. She says, to tell you the truth, I avoid reading anything about this time era slavery. As a black woman, when I read about it, any novels about it, I either feel depressed or I feel angry. And she said, when I read yours, I felt redeemed. There's something redemptive about what you wrote. And it's like, I don't care if anybody else reads it. That was exactly, she put into words what I wanted to accomplish. Other avenues it's finding is so cool. I'm getting calls from doulas. 3 months ago, I didn't know what a doula was. Anybody know what a doula is? Are we got any doulas here tonight? Wonderful. It's like these people attend birthing mothers, and they have enjoyed the book. And I just found out from Judith that they're reading chapter 48 to the birthing mother. So here's this gay guy actually gets into the birthing room after all. So that's extremely powerful to me. And hospitals, have a friend here, Carla, and she is chaplain at North Memorial Hospital. And they're going to let me do the keynote speech for National Nurses Week. So this is finding its way into health communities. This morning I had a meeting with, I don't know if you know, Clarence Jones. He's in charge of Southside and does a lot of outreach programs for minority and, you what? And he wants to find a way to get the book out to, for example, people who are involved with child mortality and infant mortality. So people are seeing it as a metaphor bigger than the story. So I'm extremely pleased with that. So that's a little bit about the book. What I want to do now is read to you, if that's okay. Do you mind being read at? Okay. The plot of the book is that it starts in 1860 on a southern plantation. And Master Satterfield is losing his slaves. And his slaves are dying of this mysterious disease. It's called black tongue. And only slaves are getting it. So they think it must be just an animal disease because white folks don't get it. And they've called the white doctors in, and all the white doctors know to do to slaves is treat them like animals. So they either blister them, or they purge them, or they bleed them, or whatever. They have these violent remedies. And they were killing more than they were saving. Now, Master Satterfield doesn't like what you call buy off the plantation. He lives in the Mississippi Delta, has thousands of acres there. Mississippi Delta has not yet been cleared. So it is like living on an island surrounded by alligators. If you've ever been to Mississippi, the penitentiary is called Parchman. Parchman is 30,000 acres. They don't have fences because nobody ever gets off the place alive. And that's the same basis that he had on his plantation. He figured that if he bred his own slaves, then he wouldn't have to deal with abolitionist ideas. He could make them more docile. But he was losing his livestock, so he decided he would have to go off the slave plantation. He heard about a slave healer. She was an ancient woman. She lived up north in North Carolina. So he paid $5,000 for a slave, which was exorbitant, so that she could find the remedies for his livestock. What we found out later, just in case you didn't know, this black tongue, if you've read the book, do you have any idea what black tongue was? Could you figure that out? It was pellagra. It's a vitamin deficiency. It was a scourge of the South because it strikes people that just eat cornbread or corn products and pork. And because they saw these people as nothing but animals, they fed them like animals. And so they had this disease that any human being got. They just thought it must be a black disease. And the first thing that she does, the master says, I just spent $5,000 for you, for all that stuff in your head. Now, you don't go die out on me, because I will be out of my investment. The first thing you do is pick you out an apprentice and teach her everything that you know, so that if you die, I'll still have the remedies. And he says, if you don't, then I'll throw you in a ditch and bury you like a dog. And in that day, being grieved into heaven was a really important part of the religion. So he was telling her, you will not be grieved into heaven. There will be no grave songs. You won't have a marked grave. So she looks around, and of all the people she picks out this one girl who she sees has the sight. But she also happens to be the mistress's pet. She's 13 years old. And she's been living in the big house, being raised by the mistress for 13 years, petted by the mistress, because the mistress lost her daughter 13 years earlier. And she was so crazy and so angry at her husband, she went to the slave quarters. She took the blackest baby she could find, brought it into the big house, and raised the child as her own daughter, mainly as an ornament to make her husband angry, to drive her husband mad, seeing the daughter's clothes on this slave's back. But of course, with a girl named Granada, she doesn't know where she belongs. The only mothering she knows is from this demented white person who kind of uses her as a tool. But yet that's what mothering is to her, and she doesn't want to leave it. So Polly says, I choose you. You're going to come in the hospital with me and take care of your people. Granada's saying, what do you mean, my people? My people are these white ones in the house. And she says, no, I insist. So Granada has to go live with Polly Shine. And she's resistant through most of the story. She's fighting back. On one day, Polly takes her to the woods. And Polly goes every once in a while to find her herbs and find her roots. And so this is a time when they're both in the woods. She found Polly in a place where daylight filtered through a lush canopy of honey locust and red maple. From there, she watched as Polly bent over and began stabbing at the ground with her little pickaxe, digging up sundry plants by their roots. She examined them carefully, pinching the leaves, peeling back the bark, breaking open the stems. Polly tasted everything. After chewing on a leaf or sucking on a piece of bark or a bit of root, sampling an early spring berry or putting her tongue to gummy resin, she registered her verdict with either a nod or a shake of the head. At first, Granada thought Polly was talking to herself as she worked, but the girl had been wrong. Polly talked to the bits and pieces she was studying, like they were old friends, not seen for a long time. Some she was just meeting. She spoke in a steady, rhythmic fashion that after a while sounded to Granada more like music than talk, lulling the girl from a dreamy, half-awake state. Eventually, everything the woman said bled together, and Granada really couldn't tell if she was speaking words or just made-up sounds, or perhaps she was singing after all. The spell broke when Granada spied Polly doing something that she couldn't keep silent about. "Why are you eating dirt?" Granada blurted. If it had been little Lord doing such a foolish thing, she would have slapped his hand. Polly eyed the girl briefly and then spit. She bent over and dug up a burdock plant and began to do the very same thing, scraping the root and putting the dirt in her mouth, squinting her eyes and creasing her forehead like Sylvie did when she was sampling a new batch of soup. Granada shook her head, disgusted with Polly's manners. "Miss Prissy think I'm eating dirt?" Polly mumbled to herself. "If Miss Prissy was watching like I told her to, she'd see I ain't eating dirt. I'm reading it." Polly hadn't spoken to her in so long, Granada figured maybe she misheard the words and laughed at the silliness of the idea. When the old woman scowled at her, she realized Polly was indeed spoken the words, and more than that, she was dead serious. "What'd you say?" Granada said, incredulous. "You read in dirt?" Polly nodded once and then looked around her, taking in the entire forest with her gaze. "The plants and animals and even the dirt, they got words too." Then she looked at Granada. "What makes you think you're so special? They talking to you?" "They talk to anybody got a mind to listen." "What they saying right this minute?" Granada sassed. "Don't know why I'm wasting my breath, but I'll tell Miss Prissy anyhow. They telling me of a place where there ain't no sickness, no aches, no misery." Granada knew the answer to that riddle from the white preacher. "Heaven," she blurted. "What you know about heaven? I'm talking about right here." Polly stabbed the ground with her stick. "In front of your face, the leaves, the bark, the roots, the berries, the dirt, they all got memory. They hold the memory of how things supposed to be. They all got secrets to tell." Polly held out a pinch of the dirt before Granada. They tell you how to put things right. All we got to do is listen. When Granada opened her mouth to argue, Polly slipped a bit of dirt on the girl's tongue. Granada gagged and spat it out. You got to hold it with your mouth shut, Miss Prissy. Open wide and be still. She put another speck of dirt on Granada's tongue. She held it in her mouth this time. What's it say? As the girl stood there, it turned to mud. Do it taste like salt or sugar or more like rust? Do it bite back? Do it draw up, she asked without pause? Do it act like it wants you to swallow? Or do it make you tired? Do it make your stomach rise up and want to heave? The only thing Granada knew was she had to get the miserable mess out of her mouth. She spat and then wiped her tongue with the hem of her dress. Polly cackled at Granada's squeamishness, and the girl sassed, You can't read dirt no more than jaybirds can talk. You're a silly old woman. She took a step back in case her words warranted a slap. And you ain't nothing but a pish-tailed girl who don't know nothing in the world except your own self. And pitiful little about that, you still ain't ready. How can I get ready if you don't tell me nothing? I can't tell you how. A head full of how ain't gonna do nobody no good. You got to stand back and watch and listen. Polly looked up at the intricate weave of treetops and vines that sheltered them. Just like all these trees, you got the memory too. How can I remember something I don't even know, she asked. When you start reaching out with something besides your greedy hands, Polly shot back, that's how you slip into the remembering. You got to be quiet and let it come to you. You can't go hunt it down, and showing off and having a smart mouth don't make it come any quicker. Granada kicked at the ground, remembering. That don't make any sense. So that was one of their encounters. I'll read you one of the birthing scenes. Even though they were the ones I dreaded doing the most, they were the ones that were most fulfilling for me to write. They were the ones that, I don't know, I said, oh, I finally get it. I finally get what this is about. At this stage, Polly is going out to the slave settlements. The master has different settlements all over his land. And Polly goes out and helps deliver babies when she's called for. And she takes Granada along with her, but Granada so far is not allowed into the birthing room because she's not yet a woman. So she stays outside this circle of things. So she doesn't know about it yet. So Granada's in one of the settlements now. Polly's been in the slave quarter in the cabin now for most of the day. It's been a difficult birth. Now Granada looked up to see that many more people were milling about in the yard. Children had gathered dry wood and pine nuts, and a fire blazed in the lane. The men talked quietly while the women carried babies on their hips. But whenever some commotion rose from the direction of the cabin, everyone went still, as if they were awaiting some important pronouncement. Firelight reflected the great anticipation in their eyes. As Granada sat alone, feeling a stranger to everybody and everything around her, the door creaked open, and out came the sick woman's man. He wiped his hands anxiously on his dirty pants and then reached into the pocket of a ripped shirt for a clay pipe. He sat down on the bench next to Granada. You Polly's apprentice? The man asked, twisting his pipe stem with his thick, blunt fingers. Granada shrugged, not knowing what he meant by that word. He smelled of sweat and tobacco, and Granada inched away. Well, he said, taking her lack of response in the affirmative, don't reckon you could ask for nobody better than Polly to learn under. That's what I heard anyway. He laughed self-consciously and said, she make the lame walk and the blind sure enough see. At least that's what they tell me. They right about that, ain't they? He looked at Granada for reassurance. They say she totes her conjuring herbs in her sack. Some say she do hoodoo on folks. When she still didn't respond, he muttered softly, sure hope she knows what she's doing. He tapped the bowl of the pipe against his palm and glanced over at his own two sons, who stood at the edge of the porch. He lowered his voice and said, Sari done lost the 3 babies before this one. Last baby nearly took her with him. You ever seen Polly do this before? Do what? Granada asked. What's she doing? Don't you even know why you're here? She don't tell me nothing, Granada grumbled. Granada, girl, my woman's having a baby, he laughed. Thought for sure you knew that. Thought you came here to help. She got a baby in her belly? Granada gasped. She had heard about this happening to women, but she had never actually seen it up close. That why she's sick? The man laughed. She ain't sick, she's bigged. And that baby trying to get himself born this very night. Granada thought about that for a moment. Why didn't Polly want Granada to know anything about babies? She wondered. Over the next hour, it was Polly's voice that dominated within the cabin, handing out orders left and right. As the hoarse cries from the woman grew more desperate, Polly's instructions became more succinct, sometimes comforting and other times insistent. Bear down harder, she would call. And then she would croon softly, that's real good, Sari. Now breathe in and out real easy like you're blowing in a jug. And in the next moment, she would be hollering at the woman again or commanding the others to get Sari on her feet and walk her around the room. Finally, the woman cried out, something ain't right. I can't do it no more. It wants to kill me. There followed the sounds of the women calling out Sari's name, telling her she was in God's hands now. Let it roll with God, they cried. He'll see you through. Yes, Lord, the man next to Granada said. Sari released a heaving groan that threw a deathly quiet over the entire yard. The only sounds now were pine knots popping in the fire. Sari's man leaned on his arms and knees, clasped his hands together and mumbled his prayers, while his son stood wide-eyed against the porch railing, the older boy's arm wrapped protectively around his little brother. Those in the yard began their silent prayers. God was beseeched with one voice, and in that long moment, there seemed to beat only one heart, growing stronger and louder. Granada's entire body throbbed with it, and when she felt that she couldn't contain the surging force any longer, there came a cry of a newborn baby breaking over their heads like a sheet of lightning. The entire community answered the new arrival with a spontaneous cry of its own. Sari's man jumped up, flung open the door, and charged into the cabin. Granada, filled with the wonder of that moment, found her legs and stood to gaze through the door. The grease lamp on the table cast a golden circle around the group. They were all looking down adoringly at Sari, whose face radiated light. She held a tiny child close to her, its little arms reaching. Granada fixed her eyes on Polly as she stood tall and erect, looking down on the mother and child, the disk winking in the lamplight. She neither smiled nor frowned. Her countenance begged no gratitude. Her expression was so complete in itself, nothing was required of those who saw her but to love her, and Granada could not help doing so herself. Sari reached out to Polly, and after taking her hand, brought it to her own glistening face. Granada did not know that she herself had begun to weep. God bless you, Mother Polly, Sari said, her voice liquid with tears, and then she did a surprising thing. She lifted the baby in her hands and offered her child to Polly. Without speaking, Polly gathered the naked child and swaddled it in a piece of snow-white linen. Then she lifted the child to her lips and kissed it on the brow. When she returned it to the mother's arms, she leaned over and spoke very softly what Granada thought must have been a single word, but one that could be heard only by mother and child. So that was the birth scene. Thanks. Good. Just so you know, any idea, if those that haven't read the book, what the thing that she would whisper into the mother's ear would be that only the mother and child could hear? It'd be the child's name. What Polly knew, she had a saying that people don't see anything until somebody names it. And the white man has named everything. And if we're going to take back our power, we're going to have to rename the world. And so when the white doctors looked at a slave and saw them as livestock, Polly looked at a slave and saw them as a mother, as a father, as an aunt, or as an uncle. Naming was the privilege of the master. So the babies were brought to the master, and the master would give them some cute name. Greek names and Roman names were popular. To see a slave named Plato or Socrates or Pomp or whatever. But Polly gave them a secret name. And there are tribes in Africa who believe you don't let anybody know your child's name for a long time. Otherwise, they can steal the child's soul. So Polly knew that they had to start naming, and they needed to start by naming each other. But to hold that name close until freedom, when you can release your name to the world. So, well, that's, I'm kind of talked out. What I would like to do is just kind of open it up for any kind of questions you'd like to ask. And since the first question is always the toughest to ask, we'll just start with the second question. Anybody? Over here. Prue.
Where did you get the inspiration for the naivety for Granada? I mean, she was wonderful.
Granada's an interesting character. Most people read the book differently depending on their experiences. Southerners read it differently than Northerners. I found that oftentimes African Americans read it differently than white folks read it. Granada, most white folks hate Granada. They just want to take her and slap her. But oftentimes black folks understand what Granada's dealing with. She's dealing with this whole thing about belonging. And Granada, every black person in this country has to deal with that same issue, I don't know how many times every day. Where do I belong? Where are my people? And so Granada represented, to me, she's carrying the biggest cross that people in America carry today, and that is, where do I belong? And do I believe the lies that I see 24 hours a day on TV, and all that glitters and all that gleams and all that people say you should look like? When I lived on the north side, Jordan neighborhood, that was when I got an idea that midwifing was more than an individual act, it was a spiritual act. And something about Jordan itself, that neighborhood was begging for midwifing. It's like the community wanted to be healed. And yet the way it was working, when a black couple got enough money, the first things often they did was get out of the north side and go to Brooklyn Park or go to some wider neighborhood. And of course we all think, well, sure, you should do that. But then I noticed some black folks, when they had the money, very few, they would stay because they wanted to stay in the community. But think about that. It makes sense. You want to get your child away from, maybe there's some dope dealers around, or maybe there's violence. So you want to get them to a safer neighborhood with better schools. But the price of that is taking the child into some foreign land where beauty is not a reflection of who they are anymore, where intelligence may not be, where leadership may not. So they're a stranger in their own land, and they grow up going, where do I belong? And how do I belong? And the ones that stay, they may have to deal with some of the crimes of poverty, yet their children also grow up knowing a sense of belonging. So I think that's when people come to America, as white people, we often say, assimilate, 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 like that's the easiest thing in the world. And every culture has been able to do that, from the Poles to the Irish to everybody, except there's some trick in the game that African Americans are not allowed to do. There's some schizophrenia that we put on them. We want you to assimilate, but we don't want you to assimilate. So there's all that push and pull. So Granada is frustrating, but Granada is dealing with the sin of this country. Yeah. And her naivete around birthing was my own. I didn't know anything about the birthing process. In fact, first book, if you read Delphi, I don't know a lot about women's stuff, and yet I got these women that talk in my head. All my major characters are women. I would do anything if I could find one strong male character. And I try, because I don't want to be called, you're called a sissy or whatever. But I swear, the men that I write are just boring. They just sit there on the page, leaden. And I used to wonder about that. When you think about it, though, the way I grew up, on the family reunions, for example, all the men would go to the front porch. All the women would go back to the kitchen. And on the front porch, the men would smoke their cigarettes and talk in one-syllable sentences and go, got a V8, what you got? Oh, got me a Ford custom built. What's the cotton prices? Heard 28 cents a pound. They didn't even look at each other when they talked. They could have been talking to the mailbox. It was just nothing. You go to the women, And all of those sisters and the grandmother were there peeling potatoes, and the pots were boiling off the stove, and they were throwing stories at each other. And you may have heard these stories a million times, but it didn't matter. They told each story the same way with that much enthusiasm, because they were telling you, this is who we are. You need to remember this. They're telling stories on each other, and they'd laugh. They'd tell stories on the neighbors. They'd tell these funny stories, irreverent stories on their husbands, which they couldn't tell in front of them. So they were making fun of their husbands. So I realized this is a place of conspiracy. And I like being, because I wasn't any fool. I went to the kitchen and stayed with the women. In the same way in churches. All the men, I think it's maybe the same in African-American churches, all the men go to the front porch and they smoke their cigarettes and talk about whatever men talk about, whatever small animal they killed that weekend or whatever football team was playing. But the women stay inside and they're talking over the pews, those big hats with those flowers nodding up and down as they talk about the most unchristian things I've ever heard in the church. So it's the women that were the strong characters for me. And when I wrote my first book, Hazel is a major character, which is really pretty accurately based on my mother. And I had her get married, and then I skipped 3 years, and she has 3 children. And my writing teacher said, wait a minute, you can't do that. I mean, having a child is a really big deal for a woman. You just can't say, okay, now she's got 3 kids running around the house. I said, no, I don't want to go in the birthing room. She says, you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to know what she's going through. So I said, okay, just tell me what it's like without getting too gruesome about it. What's it like? How can I know about the birthing room? She says, imagine this. A woman is wheeled in there, and for the first time in her life, she knows she can't back up. There's no getting out of it. She said that is the most defining moment a mother can have. So it's like, okay, that's enough. So luckily, a lot of women weren't embarrassed by my embarrassment. Were able to tell me what these things meant so we could get it away from the biological things that distract, but more the emotional human community things. That was a long question to an answer. I'm not even sure what your question was. Anybody else? Hey.
Tell us a little about your writing process.
Sure.
And do you know the basic story when you start, or does the story come out of you as you write?
Yeah, the story kind of leaks out of me. I admire those writers who know the plot before they sit down. Like I think it was Tennessee Williams, or Truman Capote said he knows the ending before he starts writing the story. I don't. Mine are character-driven. They're not plot-driven. I'm more interested in what happens to the character. So I get a character that I can spend 3 years with. They have to be pretty interesting. One of the worst pieces of advice I was ever given was write what you know. Write what you know. You know how boring that would be, just to write what you know? I already know what I know. I want to write to find out things. And I read a quote that gave me permission. The writer said that a writer's job is not to proclaim the truth, but to discover the truth. And unless the reader feels they're discovering the truth along with you, they're going to be bored. If the reader comes across as a know-it-all and just talks about with no surprises, it's boring. So the thing, I pick a riddle, something that I really want to know about. And for me, the biggest riddle for me is growing up in the South. I want to know how Jim Crow worked. That is the most amazing period of time. Because when I looked at Joe, what I saw was somebody who was really compliant, somebody who was okay with everything, because that was all he was supposed to show me. Behind Joe was a sophisticated society operating under the most cruel oppression that I could have imagined, but Joe was a deacon. Joe was a father. Joe was a hardworking man, many times highly educated, but they could not present any of that stuff. So to make Jim Crow work like it did, there had to be a society, a secret factory, a secret society that was operating, having their own standards of pride, protecting their children from the degradation of white supremacy. And so I wanted to know, because I think that story, every time Joe had to nod his head, his silence and the silence of that entire race was what gave me my white superiority. And to tell you the truth, that my white superiority has got me ahead in this world. It's given me a privilege, a feeling of entitlement. It has paid off. But once I found out what the cost of that is, and not even be able to name those people anymore. Joe's dead. I can't go back to Joe. So that now I just have this really eager understanding about how that works. And I want to find people while they still live to be able to tell me what their lives were like. So, and then I want to I find a character, then I put my character through hell, and that's where the story happens, you know. I just have a character like a laboratory event, and I'll say, well, what happens if they have a daughter that dies? Or what happens if they're humiliated? And I'll write that scene. So I'm more interested in seeing the character develop all they can be, and somehow the plot finds itself. Is that helpful? Okay. Other questions?
You talked about this a little bit, but I'd like to know if you ever did go back to your mother and find out about your own birth. And my second question would be, what responses have you gotten from your own family in regards to this book?
Yeah, my mother, the first book, like I said, the first book, if you've read The View from Delphi, the crazy woman is my mother. Hazel. I wrote that book to get even with my family. I think every author, their first draft is to get even with all the people that they didn't have the power to tell off when they were growing up. So my first book, I put my parents in there, I put my preachers, my teachers, the bullies in school, and I humiliated every one of them. It was nothing but a thinly written morality play. Very boring, but I liked it. And my mother was a drunk, and she went through. She wrecked a car in the mayor's yard our first week into this new town. Drunk, turned the car upside down. I put that in the book. I put her time in the mental institution getting shock treatments. I put how she abandoned us. So I put all of that in the book, thinking I was really going to get even with them. And so I decided I'd take the draft home and let my parents read it. You know, I said, well, for example, you know, if Oprah has me on TV, I don't want you finding about it just third person like that. And I just wanted to watch him squirm, you know. So I gave it to my dad, and he read it, and then he knocked on the door. After he read it, I was staying with him, and he said, we can't let your mama read this. I said, why? She said, she'll get in a Lincoln drunk and turn the car over. You know what's going to happen. You can't let her read it. And I said, no, Dad, we need to let her read it. It's only the truth, and she takes it personal. I can just tell her it's fiction. So I gave it to my mother, and so this entire weekend, she's got these 200 loose pages, flipping one after. She's sitting in Daddy's Lazy Boy, reading one page after expressionless, one page after the next, all our family's humiliations, all the things that she has done. And she gets to the last few pages, and then the tears start coming down. And now I'm codependent, you know. So I'm going, oh my God, I've hurt my mother. Well, how am I ever going to make up for this? And I certainly don't want to talk about it. So she said, well. But I had a master's in counseling psychology, so I kind of said, well, Mom, looks like you're having feelings about that. So, so how do you like that book? She says, oh, Johnny. She says, I love this book. I went, really? She says, except for one thing. I said, what, Mama? She says, I only wished I could have been that little boy's mama. She had totally missed it. I named the boy Johnny. It's like, how could you miss that? But after learning about my mom, I just realized she's a narcissist, and that's the beauty of narcissism, is that things that, you know, they just reflect off of them. They love the center of attention, but nothing is about them in a way. So what happened in our relationship, I rewrote the book because actually I gave it to my writing teacher. And I had really tortured this little kid named Johnny. And I thought that's how you got readers' attention. You have a character and you torture them and then make the reader feel compassion, and then you have a great book. And so I tortured this guy. I even killed his dog. And I showed my teacher this, and she was reading it, and I was so proud because I'd written a whole story. And she said, she finished in the middle. She put it down. She says, I just have to tell you, if one more thing happens to this kid, I'm going to kill him myself. So I learned that victims don't make really good characters. And so eventually, the kid took the background because she was more interested in the mother. And I said, you're not supposed to like this mother. You know, she's my mother. You're not supposed to know. She's fascinating. How did she get to drink, but also she has this sense of clothing. She loves clothing, but she was poor growing up. How did that happen? I said, that's your story. Oh, God, I don't want to do that. She says, for assignment, go back 20 years. And I had a maid in my book who, and it was based on a maid that I had when I was growing up. We had a maid for 1 year. Her name was Alma. And I hated Alma because every time Alma came, my mother left. They hired her so mother could work, but I didn't get that connection as a 5-year-old. I thought Alma was chasing my mother away from home. So I decided that I would get Alma fired. I would hide my mother's clothes and tell my mother that Alma stole it. I'd hide the coffee and say, she's drinking all your coffee, Mama, because I always heard my mother talk about how much coffee costs. So I'd do all this stuff. And finally, they did let her go. And then the writing teacher said, now this maid, she's interesting. You ought to take her back 20 years, see how she got. And so I went back 20 years, and that's when the women took over. They just would not shut up. It's like the kid, I had less need to have any sympathy about the kid. The more the story took over, the less sentimental I felt about the child. He became like he should have been a tool in the story rather than my redemption. You know you're in trouble if a character is so important to you and how the reader feels about that character is so important, you need to stop. You need to quit writing because that character carries an agenda, and a writer can't have an agenda for their characters. The character has to develop out of themselves, not out of your needs. So after the first book, I interviewed, after I got serious about writing it, my mother became my best coach for writing. In other words, she lived through that period that I wanted to know about. She became the person I went to. Well, Mama, what's it like to pick cotton? She said, oh, Johnny, let me tell you what it's like to get up at daylight when it's rained the night before and now it's 100 degrees and the steam is coming off those cotton. Just like, wow, that's great. I write it down. And all those language things, the South is full of these cute little sayings. You know, everybody kind of says those to make fun. And my mother and father were full of them. And of course, I was ashamed of them because it just meant country to me. So like my mother, every fall day, the first crisp fall day of the year, she'd get up and go to the window and say, Johnny, it's hog killing weather. And I went, oh, God, I don't want to know about that. And my dad would have this strange saying, for example, he would say, I'd be busy with my homework and he wouldn't see me. He wanted me to take out the garbage. But then he'd notice that I'm busy and he said, oh, go on with your rat killing. Go on with your rat killing. Ugh. I kind of knew what it meant. So why can't you just say that? So I avoided all this stuff until I wanted to write a book. And then I realized I needed some really good Southern sayings. So I went to my parents, and they know they're important now because I'm following them around with a pad saying, say that again, say that again. And what does that mean? And what I found out through my mother, we think about our parents, and I judge my parents as maybe lousy parents, but I only knew them for 18 years of their life. As a childhood, that's all that was. They had a huge life. And through that language, they introduced me to it. When she talked about hog killing with us, I said, Mom, what does that mean? She said, oh, don't you know? She says, living out in the country like we did out in Stringer, it's over 10 miles to the next neighbor, and we didn't have cars. And so we didn't see anybody all year long. No boys to date, nobody. And she said, but when you killed a hog, all the neighbors came over. They get in their wagons, they come over, they stay all day, they kill the hog, and the kids would get their cracklings, and then the women would be, pulling the hairs off, but they'd be telling stories. The men would have a little whiskey, and they'd be laughing under the trees. It was a celebration. So what my mother was telling me was joy. When she felt that, she was telling me what joy was like, but I laughed it off. And then my father, I said, what does rat killing mean? You always told me that growing up. What does it mean? He says, when you're growing up on a farm as poor as we did, you have your seed corn. That's the corn you save to plant for the next season. And if you don't have seed corn, you don't eat for the next year. So you got to protect your seed corn. We had corn cribs. We also had rats. And you had to rats were your big enemy. And we couldn't afford a lot of ammunition. So what we'd do at night, one would have the gun, other would have the flashlight. We'd hear something ruffling you'd throw that light, and then you'd shoot as fast as you could. You could not take a second because you had to kill that rat when you saw him. So what he was telling me in that saying was what it was like for a poor boy like him to survive, how important every action was when he was growing up. And their language especially gave me open doors into their soul. And I fell out of it. No longer was important for me to approve of them or disapprove of them as parents. They became the most marvelous characters that I've ever met in my life. And I just fell in love with them through that again, just through the lives that they lived. And with the second book, it's so cool because I get to call, my dad passed away and he was around for the first book, which is great. They went to all my readings. My mother goes to any bookstore that's in town and makes sure they got my book in the front. My son wrote that book. I went in the window. She lives in an assisted living, and she has everybody in the assisted living complex reading my book. She sells them out of her room. Everybody has to read it. And then when I come down for each book, we have a reading at the assist. So all these people come in their wheelchairs and et cetera, and this is the best audience I've ever had. And my mother gets to introduce me, and so it's really cool. So now when I have a Southern problem, I just call her up. I say, Mama, how do you make cornbread? And sometimes I know something, but I just want to call her up and ask her anyway, because I just love that relationship that we have now. So, and in the back of the book, I let her proof my book through every stage. So it was like being back in the 3rd grade. She was doing my papers and correcting the words. So she's an important part of my writing process now. And they were really relieved when I told them the second book was not about them. So, yeah. I do have a 3rd book, and I'm about 100 pages into it, and it's called The Last Safe Place. And I once heard, I used to get embarrassed because all my books seem to be about the same things. And then a writing teacher told me, great writers keep writing the same book over and over again, because what it means by write what you know is find those things that are close to your heart. I know about belonging. I know about grief. Every book that I have is going to have a lost child in it. I know that in my bones. I know how to write that. So this one is about 2 lost kids looking for a place where they belong. But as far as my writing process, I worked as a consultant for a lot of years. So I was in front of groups teaching, and that calls for a different part of the brain. To write, I didn't start writing until I was 45 years old. I was kind of beat up for even wanting to write in the Deep South. I like to write poetry, and that's not something as a male in 1960, you go out on the street corner and say, look, I wrote a brand new poem. You're suspect already. In high school, I wanted to be a writer. When you get under pressure, maybe you go to these places in your head. Some people go to the beach, and some people go to the mountaintop, and you feel relaxed. In my mind, when I get tense, I go behind a desk with a typewriter, and the door's closed. To me, that would be the ideal existence, I thought, to have this cone of silence drop over you. And writers write all their thoughts down with nobody around, and then you kind of send it out through the door, and other people read it, and you don't have to be there. So as far as Shy Boy, it looked like the perfect kind of safe existence. So I always kind of wanted the idea to be a writer, but anytime I try, it got screwed up. In the high school, we had a creative writing course. I said, okay, I'm going to risk it. I'm going to write it. So I wrote this story, and the kids loved the story. I can still remember it. I went to the story's about a kid who goes to eat dinner at a very rich home, and the people have all these silverware, and he doesn't know what silverware to use, and he's embarrassed, and he drops things on the floor, and then this girl next to him starts pointing to which ones he should use, so like she's his savior in the story. And the kids just love the story. There's no feeling in the world when you write something and then you give it to somebody and then they write it and they have a feeling about it. It's just an amazing, it's like, God, I communicated that through this magic thing. I'm not telling them, they're reading it, I'm not even there, and I'm having impact. So when they laughed and loved the story, I said, that's what I want to be a writer. Then the teacher hadn't said anything, she was quiet, and she said, I only have one thing to say. She said, use the word Savior. And I don't believe you should use the word Savior except when you're talking about Jesus Christ our Lord. I went, oh my God, writing is dangerous. So I was so thin-skinned, I just put that aside. In college, I decided I'd go into business, something hard-edged that my dad would approve of. But I was forced to take one course, and that was a honors English course, and he made us write a poem. And all I knew about writers, thank goodness, was they all got drunk when they wrote. So I decided, okay, I've got to write this, I'll go get drunk. So I wrote this poem, I turned it in, and I just did not want to, I wanted to be done with it because I knew it was horrible. But he handed them out, and I remember him handing the page, putting it, and I got it and I looked at it. It had all these red marks, and I just could not talk, I just couldn't read it because I knew what it felt like to be rejected. There's nothing else more personal either than to have your writing rejected. There's something about it goes to your heart. So I put it aside and thought I'd look at it later. Well, I went into business and never wrote until I was 45 years old, and I had done what the white straight man was supposed to do. I'd made a lot of money on top of an organization, had the perfect house in Golden Valley. I had a beautiful partner who looked really good with me on my Christmas cards, had the perfect dog, the Springer Spaniel, and it was all perfect, except I just wanted to kill myself. I just wanted to die. So I went to therapists, and I said, I got everything my daddy said I was supposed to have, and I'm only 45, and all I can look forward to is more of the same. He said, you're depressed because you hate what you do. I said, hate what I do? I said, what has that got to do with it? My daddy said, if you find a job you only hate 95% of, you got a damn good job. What has liking your job got to do with it? Of course, he's Depression era. That's the way that he was taught. So I said, well, what do I do? He says, my guess is you made a promise to yourself at one time in your life when you were a kid about what life was supposed to be like, and you've broken that promise. And now you're in a position where you can fulfill that promise. And I say, what's the promise? And he says, I don't know. I'm just your therapist. You have to find out what it is. So I said, I don't know. I don't remember. And he said, well, you have to get into a place where you remember. And I said, what is that? He said, you got to quit doing the things that are killing you. Quit doing the things that say no to you, like your business. So I believed him. I gave away my business. I sold the house. I broke up with my partner. I gave the dog away. And I decided I would travel. And he said, that's a good idea. You need to travel. And he said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to London, Ireland, Scotland. And he says, no. He says, the reason you're in the mess that you're in today, a successful mess, but still a mess, is that you're a high manipulator of people. And you always want to be in control, and you put yourself in positions where you're in control that keeps you from listening to what that little voice is inside. You need to go to a place where you don't speak the language, where you finally have to rely on other people, where you feel helpless, where you have to surrender, where you have to ask people for guidance. So I did. I went to Costa Rica, went to the jungles for 3 months, and roamed around the jungles, and eventually I had this voice saying, you want to be a writer. So I came back, and for the first time in my life, I decided to dedicate myself to something that I wasn't good at. That was the theme of my life, was always, before you do anything, make sure you can win. Even before I learned to play golf, I read about it for a year. I did not want to go out there and show anybody how clumsy I was. Get good before you show up in public. This was the first thing that I decided I loved enough that I would do badly. So I have no idea what your question was. Where did we start out? It had something to do.
Well, I think we're out of time, and so
Okay.
we say thank you to Jonathan O'Dell.
One thing I want to tell you before I leave, I always forget this part of the story. When I decided to sell the house and become a writer, I was cleaning out the basement, throwing away all my papers. I collected everything, report cards from the first grade, everything. I'd lugged around from me to city to city to city. And I found that poem that I'd written in in college. And I finally said, I'm going to read it now. I looked at it, and he had given me an A- on it. All the red marks were things like, this is really good. I love this imagery. At the bottom, he had written a note, talk to me after class and see about getting this published. But it was like, it took me, till I was 45 before I could even allow the possibility of being a writer to come upon me. So anyway, that's it. Thank you very much.
So, okay, how would you like to follow Jonathan O'Dell up here, huh?